When I had initially planned this video, as it's going to be a two-part video that we're going to go through here, I had wanted to talk about the history of American political parties from a more comprehensive viewpoint than what is traditionally offered. And so today, looking at the political parties, we oftentimes see them as monoliths. And that certainly makes sense from the view that we have here in 2023, looking back to what existed before us, to see political parties as ideological monoliths. They certainly are that in many ways today, even if they oftentimes don't live up to their ideological statements. The political parties do essentially gather around a certain set of principles that they publicly state to be their principles. And even if you have some outsiders who come in and say that they want to shake things up, if they do manage to get elected, or if they do become really deeply involved in the political process, eventually they start to gravitate towards some sort of median and fall into the fold. Once I started thinking about this whole idea, I realized that there is a lot of background out there, going back to sort of the very origin of our two party system, the origin of the Democrats and Republicans, that people sort of take for granted, that leads to a lot of bad narratives, bad history, bad notions within our political sphere. That, oftentimes these notions are presented only out of short-term convenience to try to slander the other guys or the other side. But I think that we really need to go in depth about it. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought this needed to be its own separate video. So I apologize for the slightly late release on this video. I'd really wanted it to be out earlier this week. But, like I said, once I got down to thinking about it, I really realized that we needed a separate video to talk about this. And so what we're going to talk about today is, when exactly did the Republican Party stop being the party of Lincoln and the party of civil rights? And was there ever a moment early on when these two parties had crystallized ideologies that you could easily examine and that carry forward into, as I said, the eight-party system that we got in the 19th and 20th century? And of course, I'm being a little cheeky by calling it an eight-party system, but I'll explain that more in the next video. And is there anything that we can take away from that? Is there anything that we can look at? Is there anything foundational that went into that? Sure, if you're listening to this, that a lot of folks probably have a basic familiarity with the American political geography and things like that, but it still helps to go over this and to go over some of the origins of these political movements. So the Democrats are the technically older of our two political parties, having really gotten their start with Andrew Jackson, with the dissolution of the Democratic Republicans into different factions. That would be the Democrats and then the Whig Party. The Whig Party has its own rise and then steady decline, and the Jacksonian Democrats, really, even when the Whigs were alive and in their prime, were the dominant of the two political parties. The Democrats were essentially divided into three separate factions. The first faction were the Southern Democrats, who were people who had very strongly pro-slavery sympathies, because that's what a lot of their interests were based off of. The second group were what is now sometimes referred to as proponents of the Northern democracy. So that would be a lot of folks who were in mill towns and other urban areas who identified very strongly with a lot of the working class folks in those areas. They especially had a strong alignment with the Irish community that was growing in size from the 1830s, 40s, and 50s onward. And they had a tendency to look at slavery as a sort of distraction from a lot of the real issues, as they believed. Those real issues being to bring real, tangible quality of life improvements to people in factories and mill towns. And then the third group were the dough faces. And the dough faces were Northern Democrats who, rather than allying with proponents of the Northern democracy, fellow Northern Democrats had a strong tendency to ally with Southern Democrats in order to advance their political interests. And there was a pretty strong interplay between these different groups in terms of what the material interests of those groups were, but those were essentially the three big factions. Now, to come back to this one point about the Irish vote, especially in the Northeast, Democrats were very heavily aligned with the Irish vote in New York City and Boston, in a lot of areas where you had recent influxes of Irish immigration. This association with Irish voters would become one of the largest driving forces of the Democratic Party for the next 100 years in the Northeast. And then we get to the Republican Party. Now, the Republican Party formed in 1854. They came together as a disparate group of folks who generally were anti-slavery and pro-abolitionist. In the 1856 presidential election, they ran John C. Fremont and ran on an almost entirely and exclusively abolitionist platform, opposing the expansion of slavery. Now, they did probably a little bit better than you would expect for such a brand new political party, but ultimately they fell short in a lot of key northern areas. But there was a shifting tide after 1856. The biggest event that you had was the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which really helped radicalize millions of Northerners. And understand, I'm not using the term radicalize negatively here at all. But Dred Scott really radicalized a lot of Northerners who previously had been perhaps a little soft on the slavery question, radicalized them towards abolitionist sentiments. And also, in the intervening 4 years between 1856 and 1860, the Republican Party worked very hard on getting recruits from different new interest groups, and so a new coalition starts to form. And the four main proponents, rather, of that coalition are former Whig Party members, a lot of whom had very strong pro-business, pro-industry, pro-internal improvements philosophies and mindsets, but also had held anti-slavery views. Former proponents of the Northern democracy, who had been radicalized to the anti-slavery camp by the Dred Scott decision, especially in and around a lot of, as I'd said before, mill towns and other areas where these sort of pro-worker Democrats were prominent. Now, this group oftentimes excluded the Irish for two reasons. One of those reasons being the next big coalition partner in the Republican Party, which was to say former members of the Know Nothing Party, which was a nativist organization that tended to be fairly socially conservative and very strongly anti-immigrant, and specifically very anti-Catholic. They had what we would now call a good government mentality, and so they saw a lot of the corruption in machine and in patronage-style politics, and so they saw a lot of the corruption in government as stemming directly from Irish Catholic immigration and immigration from Catholic countries more broadly. They then went several steps further to link this corruption in public life with a certain moral corruption. And then the last group are sort of a mixed bag of true believer abolitionists that kind of represent sort of a lot of the social currents that were going on in the early 19th century America. People like Thaddeus Stevens, a lot of people who were deeply impacted by the Great Awakening and had been involved in a lot of the sort of proto-socialist social experiments that were connected with the Great Awakening, a lot of the commune towns and things like that. And so a lot of them joined the Republican Party just out of anti-slavery conviction. But they also oftentimes tended to have in common one or two views with a cross section of these other groups that I had already mentioned. And from this description, you might be thinking, man, this sounds like a pretty rickety coalition, and it certainly was. But nonetheless, they were able to mobilize around a common message and a common ticket. They got people out on the streets. You see the formation of Republican-aligned groups like the Wide Awakes, who were, in all essence, essentially a paramilitary group of young men who dressed in uniforms and marched the streets and attended Republican rallies and really existed as a force to fight back against a lot of the intimidation that Republican candidates were facing from Democrats. They were kind of the original woke white boys protesting, if you will. And then they were able to take this energy that was on the streets and get behind a populist candidate from the West, Abraham Lincoln. And it's often said that Lincoln was chosen because he was a, quote, moderate on abolition. And I think that this is oftentimes misinterpreted. So a lot of people hear this and they're like, oh, he was a moderate on whether or not there should be slavery. And that's not really the case. Slavery, yes or no, was very much a binary question at this point. Where Lincoln was seen as being a moderate was on the two stances that opposed slavery, which is that there was one school that wanted the gradual abolition of slavery. Slavery should not expand. And it was very much understood that if slavery did not expand and continue to expand to new states, it would eventually die because it would be outvoted in the Senate. And so there were folks who held that belief. There were radical abolitionists, the radical Republicans, who wanted the immediate death of slavery. And then even between the radical abolitionist groups, you had two different sects, essentially. You had people who wanted full citizenship for, quote, the Negro, end quote, as they would have said back then. And then you also had groups who wanted colonization being, deport everybody to Liberia or something like that, because they didn't believe that a multi-racial country could exist. And so Lincoln was seen as someone who was able to bridge these different groups because he wasn't seen as being too deeply entrenched in any of them. But Lincoln did win, obviously, in 1860. He won quite handily everywhere north of the Mason-Dixon line. I think that a lot of people, because Lincoln didn't even hit 40% of the popular vote, a lot of people think that it was sort of a weak showing, but it really wasn't. Lincoln demolished all of the other candidates north of the Mason-Dixon line, and he wasn't even on the ballot south of the Mason-Dixon line in any of those states. So it was a fairly strong showing, and it was proof that the Republicans were very effective in putting together this, free soil, free labor, anti-slavery coalition. Now, the North goes on to win the war, spoilers. And so from that point on, again, getting back to the Republican Party and their rickety coalition, the rickety coalition basically fell apart almost immediately after the end of the Civil War. So as much as Andrew Johnson gets a lot of blame, quite deservedly, for the failure of Reconstruction. You had this moment that was full of possibility, was waiting for someone to speak and interject, and all we got was this gasp of air and nothing coming out. As much as that was the case, I think it's also important that you take a look at what happened to the Republican Party after the end of the Civil War. So, what did happen? Well, as I'd mentioned before, the Grand Old Party, and it was already being called the Grand Old Party 18 years after its initial formation. So, the GOP was a sort of hodgepodge of mixed interests that didn't really seem to form an obvious coalition. Once the war was over and the central question that had united all of these people was essentially resolved, which was slavery. The central question was not what we do after slavery. The central question was slavery. The Republican Party essentially split into two different groups. And those groups were the radical Republicans and the liberal Republicans. And the term liberal here might be a bit confusing. These were the more conservative Republicans of the two groups. Liberal kind of being used in the way that, your friendly neighborhood right-wing libertarian might say that they're a classical liberal today, or also how liberal is oftentimes used in worldwide discussions, global politics, where it means, somebody who is for having freedoms, but not oftentimes having the government intervention required to uphold those freedoms, and also someone who has a very strongly pro-business, pro-development, pro-industry, pro-technology bent, and not really believing in things like class solidarity or power redistribution or solving systemic problems. That actually kind of sounds exactly like modern American liberalism. Anyway, what the radical Republicans wanted was they wanted those constitutional amendments, yes. They wanted the absolute right to citizenship for the formerly enslaved men, yes. But they also wanted property redistribution. They wanted the entire social structure of the South to be changed. Now, as I said, the radical Republicans, a lot of them came out of this faction of the Northern Democracy, and also some of these other folks who had been a part of these radical social movements in the North that had sprung up during the Second Awakening. And they added to their numbers after the war was over, because there were a lot of Northern political generals, Benjamin Butler being one of the most prominent who comes to mind, who had been, they had remained loyal to the Northern Democracy and to the Democratic Party even after Dred Scott. But when they went south and they saw the reality of what was going on down there, they spoke with formerly enslaved people. They actually had to deal with a lot of these arrogant slave owners face to face and learn what these people were like. A lot of them turned very strongly towards the radical Republican side, and they became some of the standard bearers for the radical social movements that would come forward in the later part of the 19th century. But the war had had effects that went beyond just the resolution of the war and the end of slavery, and the questions about Reconstruction. So the industrial capacity of the North increased substantially during the course of the war. A lot of people who had been very rich before the war started became very, very rich because of government contracts, because of the need for more iron, more steel, more uniforms, all this stuff. And this wasn't just in the North. The South also had a very large increase in their own industrial capacity during the course of the war. And so the the new wealth interests and financial interests that had emerged from the war were even more powerful than a lot of the ones that had existed prior to the war. And then you also see before, during, and after the war, the birth of America's first mass political movements. As I said, you start with the Wide Awakes before the war, and that was by every measure a modern mass political movement as we would see it. There were protests, there were people getting together, there were people who weren't afraid of mixing it up in order to defend a cause. And during the war, you see hundreds of thousands of men going off to battle, identifying with a specific cause, and then kind of building this understanding of their own capability to affect changes and affect outcomes in their own environment. And sort of with the rhetoric of the war and with the rhetoric of Abraham Lincoln and with the rhetoric of a lot of the radical Republicans, they had this new understanding of this country as a country of, by, and for the people, and a new understanding, as I said, of their power within that structure. And then after the war, a lot of these folks again started to organize. They believed in that free soil, free labor ideal. They believed that this was a country that was for the average person. A lot of the proto-labor unions in this country started to form in the 1860s and the 1870s. That's when you get the Knights of Labor and a lot of the first labor strikes. Women's suffrage became a major issue for a lot of radical Republicans. A lot of them were supporting it even before the war and had tied it to the abolitionist cause, but it came again to the forefront not long after the end of the war, and had very serious support amongst the radical Republican faction. And the radical Republicans, again under Benjamin Butler, they supported causes like the 8-hour workday. And this caused a great deal of concern for the liberal Republicans who identified more with the conservative interests who wanted to maintain their own power. And then another issue that came to the forefront after the war was over was the argument over monetary standards. And this might seem a little dry and arcane, but it's actually kind of important when you understand what the battle was actually over. So before the Civil War, you see these arguments over the gold standard or the silver standard, and ultimately the United States government decides to go with a bimetal standard. So we're using both gold and silver. And when you have a bimetal standard, that tends to create a lot of panic buying and selling. As one drops in value and the other increases, it created a lot of instability in terms of the value of the money. But also there was a lot of coinage shortage in the early days of the Republic, because when your money it's attached to the value of an item, people who already have a lot of wealth tend to hoard that item. And so during the war, when we needed a lot of money to be created rather quickly, we got around this problem by printing the greenback. And so this kind of marks the first time that we have something that's sort of resembling a fiat currency in the United States. Greenbacks weren't entirely without a standard. I mean, they were. The idea was that they could eventually be guaranteed by gold or silver, but the fact that we were able to create new money that then ended up in the hands of people who frankly, prior to this had struggled getting money because so much of the specie was being hoarded by people who already had wealth, that affected people's conception of money. And so you had an awful lot of people who wanted to keep greenbacks in circulation, maybe not as a standard currency, if you will, but have them continue in circulation backed by the credit of the United States, which in turn, again, was backed by gold and silver, and keep that money supply flowing. As And then, as another alternative to that, you had a lot of people who wanted to go to a silver standard. Silver was more abundant. They'd recently made several major silver strikes in the western states, and so there was good reason to believe that the supply of silver was going to grow in the future. However, the United States government seemed to be determined to withdraw all greenback currency as soon as possible. The greenback wasn't very well liked by financiers because it was a ready money supply that was not easily within their control. And any form of fiat money just simply did not support their interests. While inflationary or hyperinflationary economies aren't good for anybody, economies with a moderate level of inflation oftentimes can be very good for people who are on the bottom of the economic strata, because that little bit of inflation, as long as wages are keeping up, that little bit of inflation also means access to more money and credit. In contrast, if you already have a lot of whatever your society values, whether that's gold or silver or stocks, then inflation doesn't really help you out a whole lot, because you don't have to worry about the rate at which you're borrowing money or whether or not the money supply is about to contract. And if you happen to be in a position of privilege, then even deflationary economies oftentimes can be very advantageous to you. One of the biggest drawbacks of having a hard metallic standard like this is been observed throughout all of history, going back through the Middle Ages and through Roman times, and that is deflationary spirals. What tends to happen is you have economic and population growth. The money supply doesn't keep up with that. Prices start to drop, wages start to drop, and then the people who saw the most benefit from this spike in economic activity, which is almost always well-established, already wealthy people, well, they now have more specia in their pocket because they got to benefit from the economic rise, and everybody else gets to suffer under the economic fall. So if you're curious about, well, why would you want your money to be worth less? That's the reason, because you want to keep more money in circulation if you're not amongst the already haves. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because the liberal Republicans fairly solidly endorsed what they were calling at the time sound money, which is to say a hard metallic standard. And this is all about to be very important in a few seconds here. So you have a ruling political party that is really only the ruling party because the other political party, the Democrats, are completely on their backs at this point. But all these contradictions that are built up, they have to be resolved eventually. You can't go on with a party that has this many internal contradictions just rolling on forever. And so how did all of this eventually come to a head, and what ended up happening? Well, unfortunately, somewhat predictably, the liberal Republicans eventually won the argument. The Grant administration had actually pursued something of a moderate path between the radical Republicans and the liberal Republicans, but Grant was only president, and he couldn't affect the currents that were going on around him. And so how a lot of this ended up getting resolved was, number one, a number of northern states during and just after the war passed laws either provided for a statewide poll tax or enabled jurisdictions to pass poll taxes within their states. Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Massachusetts all did this. And we normally associate poll taxes with southern states. And while poll taxes did eventually come about 10 years or sometimes even a little bit longer after Reconstruction, we'll talk about this a little bit more in our next video. The southern states had other methods of suppressing the newly freed black voters in their states. But poll taxes had eventually come there. But after the Civil War, it came first in the North. And a lot of these measures were sold as ways to suppress Democratic Irish Catholic voters and suppress their voting base and kick them off the voting rolls. But it also had the effect of suppressing many of the supporters of the radical Republicans. In general, after the Civil War, voting participation did rise due to a number of demographic and systemic factors, but this still had the effect of suppressing voters who supported a lot of more radical policies in a number of Republican-controlled northern states that had large enclaves of support for these radical policies or for the Democratic Party. The second event was the passage of the Coinage Act of 1873. Now, in the argument about standards and what type of system we should go with, the people who favored sound money wanted a full gold standard, and so they went for it, and that's what we ended up with, and it ended up drawing an ungodly amount of money out of circulation. And then this in turn precipitated, in part, the Panic of 1873 and what until the 1920s and 30s in American history was known as the Great Depression. It's now commonly called the Long Depression. It lasted from 1873 until 1879. It lasted a lot longer in some places around the world, but in the United States it lasted for about 6 years. And the interesting thing to note about the Long Depression is that the actual economic activity of the United States did rise for the majority of it, but almost all of that new wealth creation went to the top, and it went towards the pockets of the people who would later become the first robber barons. And then all of this culminated in the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877. This is the election of Hayes versus Tilden, and the end of Reconstruction as part of the Compromise of 1877. Now, after a lot of the more radical Republicans had been disempowered within the Republican Party essentially split into two factions, the stalwarts and the half-breeds. The more radical Republicans tended to identify with the stalwarts, but as I had said, by this point, many of them had been disempowered within the mechanisms of the Republican Party. And Tilden was a Northern Democrat, but while his own platform did not focus on ending Reconstruction, a lot of his supporters, especially in the South, seemed to have understood that that's what they were getting for the deal out of supporting him. And so the election was highly disputed in 3 southern states where there appears to have been a lot of vote rigging. There was a lot of voter suppression, intimidation, and violence and other things going on throughout the South. But in order to win in the Electoral College, Hayes needed all 3 of these states. And so there was a deadlock after Election Day, and as part of a compromise to win the presidency, Hayes then bartered away Reconstruction in order to secure the electoral votes that he needed to win. if you're looking at this from the most cynical standpoint possible, you might ask the question, well, why would even those liberal Republicans, the half breeds who were not as committed to Reconstruction, why would they doom their own party's electoral chances in the South just to win one presidential election? And there are a number of interlacing factors that go into that. As I said, the half breeds just were not as committed to Reconstruction as other Republicans. They were much more linked to the business interests that at this point in time, the South was also being dominated by Northern business interests, just as the North was. And so there was a lot of money to be made there by ending Reconstruction in the South and by returning to business as usual. But to get to the other big reason, we need to ask the question, what was a political party in 19th century America? And the answer to that is that it was essentially a patronage machine. There was a lot of money to be made off of, especially with the expanding government after the end of the Civil War. There was a lot of money to be made from tariff collections, from regular tax collections, from U.S. Marshal positions. There was a lot of money to be given away in government contracts. And so with the Republican Party having been in power at this point, they'd won the election of 1860, they'd won the election of 1864, they'd won the election of 1868, they'd won the election of 1872. And so the Republican Party controlled many of the mechanisms of governance at this point, and a lot of their friends filled up those posts. And losing control of the executive branch and potentially of Congress to them meant losing a lot of money, frankly, that was being handed out to their friends through these posts. Now, when people are studying this time period in history, in the common historical narrative, we are often presented with the historical fact, as it's stated, that the stalwarts were the pro-patronage faction of the Republican Party. They're the ones who wanted to keep the patronage system going as it had been. And the half-breeds were the faction that was in favor of civil service reform, because that's what both sides said that they were for. However, if you dig deep into this, the half-breeds were just as much for the patronage system as the stalwarts were. Don't ever confuse this. Just because the half-breeds said that they were not for the patronage system doesn't mean that they weren't for the patronage system. Many half-breed politicians during this time period were caught in scandals that explicitly involved them giving away patronage positions and giving away government contracts to their friends. Look at Credit Mobilier, that's the big one, but there are also several other notable examples of half-breed aligned senators and governors getting caught up in corruption scandals because they too were taking advantage of the patronage system. The real difference between these two groups was material, because the patronage system itself ultimately was about the two sides' material interests. I had mentioned before that the Irish Catholics in the United States were very heavily aligned with the Democratic Party. And the reason for this was because of the patronage system. If you lived in an Irish Catholic neighborhood, then your best chance of getting any attention from the government was to vote for the Democratic Party. If you were an Irish Catholic individual, your best opportunity for advancing into the middle class was through the patronage system of the Democratic Party. Likewise, on the Republican side, if you look at what was really going on, the stalwarts were more inclined to give patronage positions to party loyalists and friends of theirs who they had met through connections, and frankly a lot of middle and lower middle class folks got into the patronage system and advanced their own standard of living through the stalwarts. The half-breeds tended to gauge worthiness for civil service postings based off of their conception of meritocracy, and they talked about meritocracy quite a bit. But what was merit in their minds? Well, merit was business acumen, it was educational qualification, it was all the things that their friends had that the people that they didn't like on the other side of the Republican Party or in the Democratic Party did not have because of their background. And so when you look at it through this lens, they're also just guys trying to get their friends paid, but they're using this notion of meritocracy and of civil service reform as a way of doing that. But both of these sides were equally invested in the patronage system, and both equally felt that they had a lot to lose if they lost control of that patronage system. And they would have had they lost the presidency and lost a lot of these government postings. And so ultimately, a large part of the reason they gave up Reconstruction, they bartered away Reconstruction, was also to maintain control of the patronage system. And that's how they got a lot of Republicans on both sides to swallow this pill, regardless of where they stood on public principle. And so the first thing that they were all thinking of was not the plight of the poor free man. They were thinking about lining their own pockets. And so at this point, the Republican Party has given up on mass politics. They have given up on on free labor, on the economic justice platform they ran on, to borrow a more contemporary phrase. They'd given up on, Lincoln's popular democracy, and they now, while Grant had done his best to keep it alive during his administration, they'd now given up on Reconstruction. And so this is the point, not 1970s. The 1870s is the point when the Republican Party, in practice, ceased to be the party of Lincoln, ceased to be the party of civil rights, and was now just a party that represented big business interests and those who were tied to them. And all of these decisions that they had made, all of these decisions that had disenfranchised a large percentage of their own voter base because they didn't like them, these decisions that had precipitated a depression, an economic depression, that brought back the Democratic Party because they lost, amongst those who could vote anyway, they lost significant portions of that base that had carried them into the Civil War. A lot of those people either fell off the political map or they started realigning with the Democrats again. Now, that's not to say that the progressive Republicans, the populist Republicans, the radical Republicans died out completely after this. They did retain some power, especially in some areas of the upper Midwest and some areas in the West as well. It's something we'll explore more in the next video. But increasingly, they became a marginalized faction within the Republican Party, to the point where, in order to get any attention at all, they had to form breakaway movements. And so in 1884, our old friend Benjamin Butler ran for president on a strong pro-civil rights platform, on a strong anti-monopoly platform, on a softer money standard platform, but he ran as the candidate for the Greenback Party. Did not do very well, unfortunately, but he did run, and this, rather than showing the strength of the movement, like with the Dixiecrats, again, something we'll talk about later, when they broke away in 1948, this showed their diminishing power within the Republican Party because they needed to form a breakaway movement just to have any voice at all. And then that gets us to Reconstruction itself. Reconstruction is often pitched in standard histories as having been a total and complete failure. It was on life support when the Compromise of 1877 happened anyway, and so it was only a matter of time. And so, the more half-breed aligned faction of the Republican Party was just acknowledging a political reality. And I think that there are some notable examples of successes of a biracial populist movement in the South that showed that even without the support of federal troops, there had been a noticeable power shift in the South during this period. And had there just been a little bit more of a push, maybe there would have been more success stories. In the late 1870s and into the 1880s, a faction that was known as the Readjusters actually took control in the state of Virginia. They took control of the state government, and they were able to get a United States Senator, William Mahone. Man, I've heard it pronounced both ways. Usually with a name that's spelled this way, you go with the man pronunciation, because why would anybody say it that way if that weren't the way? But I've heard it said Mahone so many more times. But William Mahone was a Confederate general during the Civil War, and he's oftentimes one of like the three generals who lost causers tend to cite as having been anti-slavery generals who fought for the South during the Civil War, along with Longstreet and Patrick Cleburne. And Mahone there's no evidence that Mahone was anti-slavery before the end of the Civil War, just as there's no evidence that Longstreet was anti-slavery before the Civil War, regardless of how the histories have been rewritten. But they did align with the interests of recently freed men and poor Southerners after the war. Patrick Cleburne is really the only example of an anti-slavery general who fought for the South during the Civil War. But all of that aside, Mahone was the head of a biracial coalition of poor white Southerners and recently freed men who took over the state of Virginia, again, after Reconstruction was already over. And they held power there for a few years, but unfortunately, the Democratic Party was able to harness racial resentment again and overtake them, given enough time and effort, and that movement collapsed. North Carolina is another example where even after the end of Reconstruction, you had a lot of politicians who were elected to office who were friendly to the plight, again, of the recently enslaved, now freed men. And they were able to elect their own governor, Daniel Russell, who ran as a Republican as late as the late 1890s. And then after that, the legislature passed poll taxes, and there was a lot of racial violence and anti-black riots in North Carolina, and so that coalition fell apart as well. But these movements were out there, and there was potential for aligning the interests of poor whites with poor blacks in the South. But these movements did not have the national support that they needed to thrive, and so internally they were beat down and collapsed. As I said, Russell did align as a Republican, and throughout the entirety of this period, the Republicans did still claim to be the party of civil rights and the party of Lincoln. But an organization is what it does, not what it says it does. And as I said, these movements that did arise collapsed because there was no support for them from the federal level, from national Republicans. And certainly there were an awful lot of black journalists and black writers during this period who felt that the Republican Party had abandoned them. T. Thomas Fortune, who was a very well-known, very notable black journalist who lived in the North while he was a journalist. He had been born in the South but lived in the North. Explicitly in several of his pamphlets and in several of his articles called out the Republican Party and challenged directly Frederick Douglass's notion that the black voter owed their allegiance to the Republican Party. Now, Fortune oftentimes supported Republican candidates and identified as a Republican, but as a black Northern Republican, that was his only political outlet, was through the Republican Party. But the black vote certainly was not a major constituency in the North at this time, and they didn't get a lot of attention from the Republican Party, and mostly they just had to make do with empty gestures of sympathy that carried no action. Now, as I said at the outset, when I was trying to put together the topic for this video, I realized that this needed to be its own separate portion because this is all the stuff that I feel people need to know to get us to the setup for the political system that would dominate the United States throughout the very late 19th century and into, well, basically into the 1970s. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about that political system, what it was in reality, what it was really like, and essentially how we got from that to where we are today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe if you did. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening.